Welcome to today's deep dive. We've got a really profoundly timely stack of source material to get through today. We're exploring excerpts from a book called Politics and Racism Beyond Nations, a multidisciplinary approach to crises by J.P. Lindstrup. And, this isn't your standard, dry, academic text.
Oh, not at all. It's a massive undertaking.
Yeah, it's this sweeping, on-the-ground look at how humans draw these arbitrary lines in the sand, the devastating real-world consequences of those lines, and how we might actually finally erase them.
Right, because the author is pulling from anthropology, neurobiology, psychology, even Buddhist philosophy to examine the root causes of global crises. So we're looking at everything from the microscopic changes in a traumatized brain all the way to the macroscopic movements of millions of refugees.
Exactly. So our mission today is to explore this core concept of the othering project. We're going to look at the specific mechanisms humans use to create boundaries, the boundaries that inevitably lead to racism, extreme nationalism, and violent conflict. But we're also going to pull out the very real hope woven into this text.
Yeah, how multidisciplinary approaches offer a practical way out of this historical cycle. But actually, before we step into the analysis, there is a crucial note regarding the source material that we need to address.
Oh, right. Go ahead.
The text we are analyzing today contains some highly politically charged content. The author discusses policies and actions involving both left-wing and right-wing figures and administrations. This explicitly includes the Trump administration in the United States, the Modi administration in India, and various global separatist groups. So we want to make it absolutely clear to you, the listener, that we are not taking any sides or endorsing any of the viewpoints found in this content. Our role is strictly to impartially report on the ideas contained in the original source material.
Perfectly said. And to really understand these massive global crises, the author argues that we cannot just look at the geopolitics from a bird's eye view. We have to look at the deeply personal, on-the-ground human experiences of these macro-level policies. We have to look at the individuals who are caught in the gears of the machine, essentially.
Human cost.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this by starting with the author's early anthropological work in the 1990s. He was translating asylum depositions in South Florida for Guatemalan Maya refugees who were fleeing a horrific civil war and genocide.
Right, he was taking these harrowing accounts of violence, translating them from Spanish to English so these individuals could apply for green cards. And as a researcher, he stumbled onto a pretty profound realization about how human memory functions under the crushing weight of collective trauma.
It's one of those insights that just completely shifts how you view history, because originally the author suspected some of these refugees might be exaggerating or simply repeating rumors.
Because the stories were so similar.
Almost identical. They follow the exact same narrative arc. A village is burned by the military, a specific relative is murdered, the survivors flee into the mountains, they're hunted by helicopters. It sounded so scripted that even a local refugee center leader assumed they were just repeating hearsay to game the asylum system.
Which is such a tragic misinterpretation.
It really is.
What's fascinating here is that this assumption entirely misses the psychological reality of a targeted population. Years later, the author realized these repetitive narratives were not some legal strategy. They were a collective survival mechanism.
Yeah, it was their oral history, forged in absolute devastation. The community had developed a shared narrative to pass down the true story of genocidal survival.
Right.
Even if a specific individual sitting in that deposition chair didn't personally witness the helicopter or the burning of that specific village, the story itself was the overarching truth of the Maya community's experience. They absorbed the collective trauma into their personal history so the genocide could never be erased or forgotten.
And when we take that framework of collective trauma and apply it to the broader concept of structural violence, we start to see how government policies echo through generations. The text brings this into a modern context by examining the zero-tolerance immigration policies of the former Trump administration.
Where children were separated from their parents at the U.S.-Mexico border.
Exactly. And to understand the gravity of this, the book details the case of a 6-year-old girl named Ariancy Perez.
Right. She and her father made this incredibly dangerous trek from Guatemala. They were detained at the border and then separated for 3.5 months. Her father was deported back to Guatemala, while this 6-year-old child was placed with a family in Michigan entirely without her father's consent or knowledge.
Just completely isolated.
Completely. By the time they were finally reunited back in Guatemala, Arayanchi had been diagnosed with severe post-traumatic stress disorder.
And this is where the clinical insights provided by psychotherapist Maria Basualdo really reframe how we should look at a policy like this. We usually debate border policies in political or economic terms. But Basualdo points out that to a 6-year-old child, the political context is non-existent.
They don't understand geopolitics.
Exactly. Separation from a parent isn't processed as a temporary legal hold. It is perceived as absolute, permanent abandonment. It's processed by the developing brain as a complete absence of love.
Which fundamentally rewires how that child interacts with reality moving forward. The trauma diminishes the ego and creates this profound, inescapable feeling of helplessness.
And that is the pivotal insight. Basualdo explains that the actual stressor, the physical event of being placed in a facility or a foster home, is almost secondary. What permanently alters the child's psychological structure is the subjective meaning they assign to that trauma.
They internalize it.
Yes, the child internalizes the separation as proof that the world is inherently hostile. Their brain shifts into a permanent defensive posture, constantly asking, when is the next threat coming? That foundational fear molds every future relationship and their entire worldview.
It's a glaring example of how a macro-level political directive physically and psychologically alters a human life. But structural violence and the othering of vulnerable populations is not confined to one border. The text shifts focus to India to demonstrate the sheer devastating scale of these dynamics.
The COVID lockdowns.
Right, let's look at the 2020 COVID-19 lockdown under Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The author cites Indian activist Arundhati Roy to capture the absolute chaos of this mandate. Modi gave a nation of 1.38 billion people a 4-hour notice for a total uncompromising lockdown.
4 hours to freeze the movements of over 1 billion people? It's staggering to even consider.
Millions of internal migrant workers, the people who physically build and maintain massive cities like New Delhi, were instantaneously stranded. They had no jobs, no daily wages to buy food, and zero access to public transportation.
The infrastructure just vanished.
And the book shares an anecdote that distills this immense logistical crisis into a single heartbreaking image. A photographer captured a man named Rampukar Pandit crying on the side of a road in New Delhi. He was an internal migrant worker who had just learned his infant son was deathly ill back in his home village. With the trains and buses entirely shut down, he was attempting to walk 745 miles home. When a reporter asked him about his situation, his response was just a devastating indictment of the system. He said, "I am a nobody. I'm like an ant. The government is only concerned with filling the stomachs of the rich."
That phrase, "I'm like an ant," is the purest distillation of structural violence. The text analyzes this lockdown impartially as a manifestation of profound class discrimination, driven by an exclusivist Hindu nationalist variant of populism.
Where certain groups are just left behind.
Right. In this political framework, the dominant ethnic and economic groups are prioritized, while the impoverished working class and minorities are rendered entirely invisible.
They're reduced to collateral damage. The lockdown policies were ostensibly implemented for public health, but they completely ignored the reality that the most vulnerable populations literally cannot survive a sudden, indefinite halt to the economy.
It creates a society where the poor are not just disadvantaged, they are structurally excluded from the basic right to survive.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. We've been dissecting state-sponsored structural violence, where governments exert control over populations. But the author dramatically pivots to examine the flip side, grassroots nationalist terrorism.
Right. What happens when the citizens take it up?
Exactly. He looks at what happens when the othering project is taken up by the citizens themselves to violently carve out their own nations. And he actually uses his own brush with danger to set the stage.
It's quite a tense shift, going from analyzing the policies of established nations to analyzing the violence of those attempting to birth new ones.
Yeah, so set the scene. It's 1996 in Hondarribia, this remarkably quaint, beautiful Basque fishing town in Spain. The author is a PhD student doing field research on Basque fishermen. He ducks into a local cafe for a coffee, and a man approaches him.
Just out of nowhere.
Just walks up. The man identifies himself as a representative of Herri Batasuna, which was the political wing of ETA, the violent Basque separatist group. This representative gives the author a thinly veiled death threat, informing him that his presence is not welcome and his physical safety is very much at risk if he doesn't pack his bags and leave immediately.
Terrifying.
Wryly speaking, it is not exactly the feedback you want on your academic research project.
No, definitely not. But it's a chilling reminder of the daily reality in contested regions. The author paints a picture of the palpable, suffocating paranoia that blanketed the area back then. You had masked Spanish police officers armed with submachine guns operating random roadblocks.
And on the flip
On
side,
the other side, you had ordinary villagers who were terrified of speaking into a tape recorder because they feared ETA informants might hear what they said.
just a complete, inescapable atmosphere of dread.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is a textbook illustration of political scientist Benedict Anderson's concept of the imagined community. Nationalist groups like ETA envision a pure, independent Basque state. That imagined future nation becomes so sacred, so integral to their identity, that they can justify almost any level of violence to achieve it.
Even though the nation doesn't technically exist yet.
Precisely. The text notes that ETA's campaign resulted in 829 deaths. But to the perpetrators, this was not terrorism. They framed it as a righteous, necessary military struggle against Spanish hegemonic oppression, a grievance that traces its roots back to the brutal cultural suppression under Francisco Franco's dictatorship.
They viewed themselves as soldiers defending that imagined community. But the text highlights the exact moment that narrative shattered. In 1997, ETA kidnapped and murdered a young Spanish politician named Miguel Ángel Blanco. Instead of terrorizing the public into submission, the sheer cruelty of the act sparked an unprecedented backlash.
It backfired entirely.
Millions of Spaniards poured into the streets to march for peace. It broke the spell of fear and marked the beginning of the end for ETA's popular support. And in this incredible twist of fate, the author goes from receiving a death threat from ETA in a cafe in 1996 to sitting across a negotiating table from their representatives in Oslo in 2010.
That is wild.
He was serving as a peace researcher, helping to draft the Brussels Declaration to push for a permanent ceasefire.
It is an extraordinary full-circle moment for him personally. But the text is very careful not to let us rest on the comfort of a tidy, happy ending. It dives into the profound fragility of these peace processes. The guns might go silent, but the ideological infrastructure of us versus them remains intact.
The othering doesn't just vanish.
No, it doesn't. The author notes that in modern-day Basque towns, released ETA terrorists are occasionally welcomed home by their supporters with fireworks, cheering crowds, and nationalist flags.
Consider the psychological toll of that. Imagine being a family member of an ETA victim, walking down the street in your own hometown, and having to watch your loved one's killer be celebrated as a conquering hero. The author points out that this doesn't just halt societal healing, it actively re-traumatizes the victims and keeps the social divisions raw and bleeding.
He draws a sharp parallel to Northern Ireland to demonstrate how universal this fragility is. The 1998 Good Friday Agreement was supposed to be the definitive end to the Troubles. But the text highlights a tragedy from 2019, when a 29-year-old journalist named Lyra McKee was shot and killed during a riot by the new IRA, a dissident faction that vehemently rejects the peace agreement.
It's heartbreaking.
It proves that nationalist grievances are always simmering just below the surface, ready to ignite a new generation if the underlying psychology of othering isn't dismantled.
And a major reason those divisions refuse to heal is because of how reality itself is constantly manipulated by the factions involved. The author introduces this concept of hidden transcripts, which essentially refers to the unwritten, secret agendas that govern a group's true motives, even when they completely contradict their public stance.
The active manipulation of truth to maintain the boundary lines.
Exactly. Building on that, he shares a personal anecdote that perfectly illustrates this. He was writing opinion articles advocating for peace, and he sent them out to various partisan newspapers. A unionist paper in Northern Ireland published his piece, but they went in and altered the name of the city Derry to Londonderry.
Of course they did.
Right. Meanwhile, a Basque separatist paper published his article, but they outright deleted an entire paragraph that referenced ETA's murder of Miguel Ángel Blanco. It's almost absurd, really. You write a piece advocating for peace, and a newspaper responds by playing geographical peekaboo just to make sure you know exactly whose turf you're writing on.
It is absurd, but it is also deeply insidious. They were literally erasing or altering the parts of history that disrupt their political agenda. Why this should matter to you is that it demonstrates how history is not a static record. It is constantly being rewritten in real time to normalize extreme political discourse.
You control the narrative, you control the boundaries.
Exactly. If you erase the atrocities your side committed or insist on a politically charged name for a city, you aren't just copy editing a newspaper. You are aggressively policing the boundaries of the imagined community. You are deciding who belongs and who is the enemy.
So we have all this trauma stacked up. From the invisible scars of border separation to the sheer scale of pandemic lockdowns to the entrenched violence of nationalist terrorism, it feels incredibly heavy, almost deterministic. But the book doesn't leave us stranded there.
No, it doesn't. This raises an important question. If racism, nationalism, and populism are deeply ingrained systems, how do we actually survive them? The text introduces a framework developed by scholars Rian Eisler and Douglas Fry, known as the Partnership Domination Continuum.
Okay, let's break that down.
They posit that human societies exist on a spectrum. On one end, you have domination systems. These rely on rigid, top-down hierarchies, fear, patriarchal control, and the constant threat of violence. This is the fertile soil where extreme nationalism and racism thrive.
It's the architecture of the othering project.
Precisely. It's the structure of inequality. But on the other end of the spectrum, you have partnership societies. These are built on equity, mutual respect, gender equality, and cooperation. The author is quick to point out that partnership societies are not some utopian fantasy. They have existed extensively throughout human prehistory.
It's how we used to live.
Yes. Furthermore, we can see strong elements of them in modern Nordic countries today. Nations like Sweden, Norway, and Finland structurally embed partnership into their societies through robust social safety nets, flat corporate hierarchies, and rehabilitative justice systems that prioritize healing over putative domination.
So, what does this all mean for us? How do we actively shift our global mindset from domination to partnership? The author brings in a truly multidisciplinary solution. He draws on his extensive interviews with Buddhist monastics, specifically referencing the teachings of Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh, as well as his immersive time with urban Amerindians in Brazil.
Two very different cultures.
Very different.
Yeah.
But the core unifying concept across these diverse philosophies is interbeing.
Interbeing. The fundamental recognition that existence is not solitary, we are entirely interrelated.
It is the realization that humans, non-human animals, and the environment do not exist in separate, isolated vacuums. The Amerindian philosophy views every single element of the ecosystem as having a subjective, intentional life. The river, the forest, the animals, they're all purposeful actors in a shared network.
It's a web.
Exactly. The author argues that if we fail to adopt this empathetic, environmentally conscious mindset, we aren't just risking political instability. We are facing literal existential threats. We are talking about the very real possibility of nuclear war or accelerating a sixth extinction through unchecked environmental collapse.
It requires a radical dissolution of the ego. The Buddhist concept of inner being asks us to dissolve the rigid boundaries of the self and the artificial borders of the nation-state. It demands that we see our own survival as inextricably linked to the survival of the natural world and each other.
And I want to ask you directly, the listener, why should you care about this? We live in an era saturated with information overload, hyperpolitical polarization, and deep algorithmically driven social isolation. It is incredibly easy to retreat into our respective corners and view everyone else as a threat.
It's the default mode right now.
It is. But shifting our mindset from us versus them to what the text brilliantly calls expanding the U.S. to include the them is not just some naive hippie idealism. The author is making a data-driven argument that this is a highly practical, necessary survival strategy for the human race. If we continue to other each other, the domination system will inevitably consume itself.
It is the only logical way to break the cycle of structural violence. If you truly recognize that your personal well-being is dependent on the well-being of the migrant worker in New Delhi, the refugee at the border, the person across the political aisle, and the climate itself, the entire logic of exploitation and violence simply falls apart.
It is a complete paradigm shift. Okay, let's take a breath and recap the incredible, heavy journey we've just been on with this deep dive. We started by unpacking the deeply personal, traumatic impacts of macro-level policies. We looked at how Guatemalan Maya refugees used oral history as a collective survival mechanism, and we examined the devastating psychological rewiring of a 6-year-old child facing absolute abandonment at the U.S. border.
The physical toll of structural violence.
Right. We then looked at the sheer, staggering scale of that violence with the sudden COVID lockdowns in India, which essentially turned millions of vulnerable laborers into invisible ants.
From there, we examined the terrifying reality of grassroots nationalist terrorism, specifically looking at the Basque region and Northern Ireland. We saw how the powerful illusion of the imagined community can drive people to justify horrific violence. And we discussed how fragile peace truly is when historical facts are constantly manipulated through hidden transcripts to fit partisan agendas.
But we ended on a note of profound, actionable hope. We explored the very real possibility of moving away from historical systems of domination and moving toward models of partnership. We looked at how the indigenous and Buddhist concept of interbeing, the recognition of our fundamental, inescapable interconnectedness, might be the ultimate survival strategy for humanity.
I want to leave you with one final lingering concept to mull over, something that builds on the hard science the author touches upon toward the end of the text. We discussed at length how trauma alters the psychology of a developing child, but the source material also delves into modern neurobiology and epigenetics.
The science of how trauma physically changes us.
Exactly. The research suggests that severe trauma doesn't just change our behavior. It can actually alter DNA methylation and be genetically passed on from mothers to their offspring. It physically changes our biology. So if the intense traumas of racism, genocide, structural violence, and nationalist terror are quite literally written into our DNA, inherited by the next generation before they even take their first breath, what does that mean for our biological timeline to heal a fractured society?
It means we're fighting our own biology.
It implies the scars of history aren't just recorded in partisan textbooks, they are literally living in our bodies. But consider the flip side of that scientific reality. If trauma and fear can be inherited, is it possible that the profound empathy of interbeing might one day be written into our genetic code too? If we actively practice partnership, if we dismantle the domination systems and build societies based on radical empathy for long enough, can we biologically evolve to become a more peaceful species?
What an incredible, profound thought to end on. The idea that we might actually be able to write peace into our own DNA. We want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. It has been a heavy, complex, but absolutely vital journey through the ways we divide ourselves and the ways we might come back together. Keep expanding your us, keep looking out for each other, and most importantly, keep questioning the world around you. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.